keener sense of understanding of great power politics than in Singapore. As I heard Rolf introducing me, I said, I agree with everything he said. I can go home. Thank you very much. Since the end of the Cold War, East Asia has been a very unique region. Indeed, East Asia has been the most peaceful region in the world since the end of the Cold War. We call this the East Asian peace. This is something of a public realism. If you look at East Asia, you have the two most powerful countries in the world, located either by power projection or geography, in East Asia. You have a rising power in East Asia. We all know that rising powers cause problems. Both these great powers have vital security interests in the region. Of course, China sits in the region, and America fought a world war in East Asia. And of course, East Asia is the most dynamic economic region in the world. Yet for all these factors, it's the most peaceful region in the world. Wars in Europe, Central Asia, Middle East, South Asia, Africa, crises around the world, no crises, no arms races, no wars in East Asia. But since 2010, this has been a very different region. Since 2010, we've seen considerable instability. The United States and China seem to be facing off in air and at sea and within China's 200-mile exclusive economic zone. We have China battling Japan in the East China Sea, tension with the Philippines in the South China Sea. And in these various territorial conflicts, China's on one side, the United States is on the other. Throughout this period, these 4 years since 2010, you've heard people talk about the risk of war. China and Japan, China and the Philippines. Well, this change, this new trend, begs the question, what happened? Now, we're accustomed to answering questions such as this by asking policy questions. So we'll ask, what is China trying to do? We'll say, Xi Jinping, what's going on? Or we'll say, Chinese nationalism. We'll say, why the U.S. pivot to East Asia? Why are they pushing so hard? And all these are, of course, important questions. Nonetheless, despite the policy's importance, nations make policy in the context of politics. Just as statesmen, politicians in Singapore, behave like politicians in their unique political circumstances, or the American senators and congressmen behave in the context of American politics. Great powers are no different. The political context in which they operate is going to define, to a large extent, the nature of the relationship and the consequential policies. So we have to ask, is this all policy, or is the world different today? What has changed? And I want to suggest to you today that we're seeing new politics of great power relations, new politics of U.S.-China relations. And there's a very simple answer to this. What happened? Well, it was the rise of China. Now, we're accustomed to thinking about rising powers as sources of war. Power transitions cause war. And we're all out there waiting and watching the rise of China. What will that do in the future? But we also need to understand that rising powers rise incrementally, step by step. Very frequently, gradual change over time. And at each step along that process, there can be consequences for the way great powers behave. There can be consequences for the nature of great power politics, and thus for the dynamics and trends and patterns of their behavior. And I would suggest to you today that everything we've been seeing, almost everything, policy matters, a lot of what we've been seeing since 2010 is because we are in a new era of great power politics. Now, first, to understand what this change entails, we have to understand what happened before. Why was East Asia so peaceful? Why was it the East Asia peace? Well, it wasn't as if great power competition had ended after the Cold War. It wasn't as if the United States and China were friends after all. The United States and China will never be friends. As long as we're the two most powerful countries in the world, we will be competitors. But there was a geographical distinction to be made these days between Chinese and American spheres of influence. Yes, spheres of influence. They have existed, they will exist in the future. Now, China had a sphere of influence. Still has a sphere of influence. China got a sphere of influence, you can see when. The first country to slip into China's sphere of influence, Thailand, 1975. The day Saigon fell, you had Thai diplomats take that first plane to Beijing and normalize relations. Why? Because they looked at the United States and they said, they just lost that war in Vietnam and we tied our horse to the Americans. We got to find a new friend in town. And if the Americans aren't going to protect the ties against the Chinese, we better be nice to China. If the Americans aren't going to protect us from Vietnam, well, we better find someone else, and that was China. And we're all accustomed today to understanding that within ASEAN, on the original ASEAN 5 or even the original 4 or 6, Thailand is the one with the closest relationship with China. Well, it's been like that since 1975. But then something else happened. The Soviet Union collapsed. And practically overnight, China's sphere of influence expanded. There have been almost 25 years of peace between China and Vietnam. Why? Because Vietnam, when the Soviet Union collapsed, said, how fast would you like us to pull out of Cambodia? And they got out real fast. And then they got out of Cambodia. You had Cambodia and Vietnam coming into a Chinese sphere of influence. And then all around the Chinese perimeter, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, North Korea, no other great power along that entire realm, but they all gravitated within the Chinese sphere of influence. So it's fair to say that in 1989, China was more secure than at any time since 1839, the Opium War. Because it now had, for the first time, secure borders with no great power threat, great power challenge, great power alliances anywhere on its borders. We all credit Deng Xiaoping with understanding the importance of modernization. But again, context is important. We're accustomed to saying that Mao was a revolutionary foreign policy. He was an ideological diplomat. Well, that's true. There was Chinese diplomacy with Maoist characteristics. But there was a reason Mao fought all those wars. The Americans, get off our borders in North Korea. Get off our borders in Vietnam. French, get off our borders in Vietnam. Russians, get off our borders. Fought wars for a reason. And China won every single war. Every war in East Asia involved China. At the end of the Cold War, China had won every war. So when Deng Xiaoping comes in, he says, I don't need to fight wars anymore. The whole emphasis on the foreign modernization in China's rising power economy was premised on the wars that China had won. No wonder China was peaceful. No wonder it was modernization. It won the Cold War. And yes, it's fair to say, China won the Cold War in East Asia. When the Soviet Union collapsed, yes, there were vacuums. And who filled those vacuums? Not the United States. Where we were in 1975, as a foreign presence in East Asia, was identical to where we were in 1995. Nothing changed. China, however, filled all those vacuums. Filled with Vietnam, filled with Cambodia, North Korea. So they won the Cold War. It became a peaceful country pursuing economic development. But that doesn't mean the United States didn't have a sphere of influence. Of course it did. And where was the American sphere of influence? Where it always should have been in the first place. In Maritime, East Asia. Remember, some of us, January 1950, he enacted his famous press club speech, where he delineated American security interests in East Asia. What did he say was the American defensive perimeter? And what was in there? Japan, the Philippines, and by suggestion, the rest of the South China Sea. What did he leave out? He left out Taiwan. He left out Korea. Because they didn't matter to American security. The United States went into the war in Korea not because Korea was intrinsically important to American interests, but because the Soviet Union, China, communist aggressive states had used force, challenging American credibility, And as it so happens, the first place they used force was Korea. So America went to war in Korea. Pulling back in 1975 to Maritime East Asia, we contented ourselves, the United States, with that maritime sphere of influence. And that was a stable system. Now, it wasn't only stable because the United States and China both had spheres of influence. Because after all, if you look at European history, there are lots of spheres of influence in Europe, and they still fight lots of wars. Asia was unique in that between these two spheres of influence, there was a lot of water. And that water made a difference. If you travel around the world, I don't care where you go, and you'll see fortresses. And around every fortress, you'll see a moat. I once had the privilege of having a meeting on a top floor of a building overlooking the Imperial Palace in Japan. And beautiful lake in front of the Imperial Palace. That's not a lake. That was a man-made lake that we otherwise call a moat. Water is an effective defense against armies and naval battles. So because of that water, the United States couldn't challenge China's sphere of influence. Too difficult to land on the Chinese coastline. Too difficult to fight wars in Indochina. After all, every country that went outside the region tried to fight lost those wars. But China was also too weak to challenge America. So China had a nice combination. It had secure borders, spheres of influence all around its perimeter, but it was also too weak to reach out. Well, it didn't have to reach out, because again, since 1839, it was a secure, great power. So neither country could challenge the other. The U.S. was too weak on the mainland, China too weak at sea, which meant neither could challenge each other's interests. Neither could challenge the status quo. The status quo nicely reflected both states' primary strategic interests and nicely reflected their capabilities. And because they were separated by water, and because we had giant moats between us, neither country was afraid of war. We didn't have crises. What are crises? Crises reflect a fear of war. The United States wasn't afraid that China was going to reach out across the South China Sea and attack the American Navy. And of course, China wasn't afraid the United States was going to come back into Indochina or land in Tianjin and march to Beijing. So this water had two effects. It kept us contained within our sphere of influence and created a situation which neither feared war, minimizing crisis dynamics. So from 1989 to 2010, East Asia was the most peaceful region in the world. No crises, no tension. We had wars everywhere else. Europe, Africa, Middle East, South Asia, not in Southeast Asia, not in Northeast Asia. There was still great power competition, considerable great power competition, with periodic problems. We call that the Taiwan problem. But the trend was stable. The trend was, in the context of great power competition, cooperation. Nothing could be more different in 2010 than present. Fears of war in the East China Sea, fears of war in the South China Sea, U.S. planes and Chinese planes contending in the 200-mile EEZ, our ships coming close to collision off the Chinese coast. These kind of fundamental changes, for those of us who study international politics, we don't like to associate them with individuals. When you begin to see long-term change, you look for long-term change in the underlying sources of international politics. And of course, that change, once again, was the rise of China. While we were waiting for China to reach that point on the curve, that nexus, when we worried about great power war, that was making incremental steps, incremental successes, incremental rise that had consequences far short of a precarious U.S.-China relationship, the consequences that can change great power politics. Now, most fundamental here, as Rolf was saying, was the rise of Chinese maritime capabilities. 20, 30 years of spending, 20, 30 years of modernization made a difference. Now, before we get carried away, let's first say what China can't do. This is not a Chinese Navy and is approaching that nexus of great power capability where we're going to be in a precarious relationship worrying about war. No, we're 20 to 30 years away from that. There is no anti-ship ballistic missile. I don't care what you read anywhere. It doesn't exist. For three simple reasons. The three laws of physics. Size, weight, and energy. You can't put a radar device on a missile that could track a moving object at sea. You can't put a radar device on a satellite with its weight, size, and energy. And anything you hear about over-the-horizon radar, it doesn't really work. Curvature of the Earth, the atmosphere, highly inaccurate source of targeting moving ships at sea. And of course, if you were looking for a 100,000-ton ship at sea, you might hit an oil tanker instead. It's very difficult. Chinese have all these new aircraft coming online. They have no air refueling. They can't leave the Chinese coast more than a couple hundred miles, few hundred miles. And China is still at the point in its military modernization that it can't build an aircraft engine. So China's building commercial jets. They're buying the engines from someone else. China's building aircraft, military aircraft. They buy their engines from Russia. You never want to fight a war when you have to go ask someone else for spare parts or replenishment. Not a good idea. And it has all these boats, these new missile boats with cruise missiles on them. Well, they've got two problems. One, these cruise missiles have the same problem that this anti-ship ballistic missile has. How do you find a moving target at sea? Not easy to do. Second, they have no air support. These small ships at sea, what's going to protect them? They don't have their own protection. They're too small to protect themselves. And of course, there's planes on the land beach. And yes, it's true. China does not have an aircraft carrier. There's going to happen. Half the size of the United States. 4 aircraft. Small payload, small range, not one they'd want to fight a war. Now, having said all that, they might get there one day. But let's not create a 2050 giant in 2050. So what China has as a military capability is what it's had for the last 10, 15, 20 years. Submarines, submarines, submarines. And these are really good submarines. But no one ever won a war with submarines. China's got a long way to go to challenge U.S. maritime supremacy in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. But this is not Deng Xiaoping's Navy. This is not even Hu Jintao's Navy. This is a new Navy with new capabilities with consequences. Last 20 or 30 years, this is a much better educated military. They go to military academies. China's entire education system is better. These are smarter, better soldiers. Second, this is a well-trained PLA Navy. Over time, the exercises, the training gets more and more sophisticated. Third, these may not be ships at the level of U.S. naval vessels, but they're far better than they were and far more numerous. So you put these three changes together, the Chinese maritime capabilities, and both the Chinese civilian maritime force and their naval maritime force can now spend longer time at sea than it ever could before. It can now go to greater distances than it ever could before. And now, for the first time, the Chinese Navy can impose costs on other countries. Just look at the anti-piracy exercise of the Gulf Navy. Each year, they get more sophisticated, the Chinese Navy. Why want to see what they can do. Look at those operations. Not as good as the American Navy, but much better than they were 5 years ago. Indeed, come back to this point, everything we've been watching the Chinese do, whether it's East China Sea, whether it's Scarborough Shoal, or the NIV, even an offshore platform near Vietnam, which they defend with their surface fleet, they couldn't do that 5 years ago. Couldn't do it. Now they can. 5 years, this is a new China. Now I'd suggest to you this is the new normal. China's role as a maritime country and the new normal in U.S.-China relations. China has the ability to impose costs, not only on small countries, but to impose costs on the United States. It has the ability to risk war. It has the ability to create U.S. risk of war, that 5 years ago couldn't do. And that simple ability to say, we can risk a war in East Asia, changes the behavior of small states and changes the behavior of the United States. So what we're seeing is this moat in the South China Sea, this moat in the Western Pacific. We're blurring the distinction between U.S. and Chinese spheres of influence. The geographic nature of the U.S.-China competition has changed because China can now reach off and touch America. They can reach off the coast, touch Japan, touch the Philippines, American allies. We used to talk about a mainland region and a maritime region. Now the two were distinct. Can't say that with as much confidence as you could before. Because China is now operating in both realms, maritime and mainland. And in so doing, for the first time in the last 5 years, China can challenge American security in the South China Sea. And thus, for the first time, China can challenge regional stability, calling into question an East Asian peace. That East Asian peace reflected what? Limited Chinese capabilities to reach out. Now it can reach out and can begin to challenge regional stability. Now this fundamental change in the rise of China has created new dynamics in U.S.-China relations, new great power politics that requires adjustment by the great powers to learn how to work together, to learn how to manage that relationship. Now, this new situation affects both China and the United States. For China, it is an axiom, it is a rule of international politics that capabilities determine interests. This shouldn't be surprising. When you were young, you were content with a used car. You made $2 million, you want 4 or 5 cars, including a Ferrari. You were happy before, but you wanted more. State's no different. You get more capabilities, you want more influence, you want more security. Of course, the difference is if your neighbor gets a Ferrari, you really don't care. In international politics, if not some other great power wants the largest sphere of influence, you care. Yes, it's true. In great power security relations, it is a zero-sum world. So with these new capabilities, China is going to behave differently. It will be more proactive in East Asia to defend its interests. It will defend its security, including its territorial security. It will resist adverse trends it doesn't like. And it will do things that it simply couldn't do before. Now, of course, we see this regarding the South China Sea and the East China Sea territorial disputes. Since 1949, since 1979, the territorial disputes in the South China Sea were stable. The status quo held.
No one challenged anyone else. And the only country that claimed those islands was China. They claimed the Spratlys, they claimed the Paracel. Philippines didn't. Malaysia didn't. Even Vietnam in 1958 said to China, they're all yours. They gave up their claim. But beginning in the 70s, this began to change. The Philippines, Malaysia, and Vietnam all started making claims to these islands. They all began to occupy these islands. And what did China do? Absolutely nothing. Of course, by the end of this period, Vietnam occupies more Spratlys than China. Why? Because China sat back and watched and did nothing. Now, it's easy to say they did that because they were interested in peaceful rise. But again, capabilities matter. And they didn't have the reach to do anything about it. It was a passive China, too weak to resist. And now that China can respond, it will respond. And these new policies inevitably reflect the rise of China. Japan, take the Senkaku Diaoyu dispute. In 2010, if you remember, Japan arrested a Chinese fishing boat captain who had a little bit too much to drink. And he decided to ram a Chinese Coast Guard ship. Japan detained him. And then they formally arrested him and began to put him through the Japanese legal system. China said, don't do this. Don't do this. And China's reaction was highly counterproductive to everyone. But nonetheless, it told Japan, we care. Well, this dispute ended, and things calmed down. Forward 2012, the United States told Japan, don't nationalize those islands. Xi Jinping said, don't nationalize those islands. And what did Japan do? Nationalize those islands. And what did China say? We warned you once. Once was enough. This time we act. And those ships went into 12 miles within the Diaoyu Islands. This is a new China. Philippines. Tension was building since 2010 over the Spratlys. China was warning. And then in 2012, we had the incident over Scarborough Shoal, where this Chinese fishing boat captain, inside the lagoon of the shoal, saw the Philippine Navy come, not their maritime forces, not their civilian forces, but their Navy was coming. And he got on his phone, and he called the PLA Navy and said, we're in trouble. PLA said no. They sent in their ships. They blocked the lagoon, and the Philippine Navy couldn't get out. And the scandal right back in the lagoon. Warn you once, not a second time, we will resist. This is a new pattern. And it's an inevitable pattern. And it's an irreversible pattern. A rising power with new capabilities demanding that its interests be respected. There's no going back. The era of peaceful rise is over. The era of biding your time is over. You all recall Deng Xiaoping's 20-character statement. At the end it was, accomplish something. That's what this is now. It's not bide your time, it's accomplish something. And it's actively accomplish something. Now, this reflects the rise of China. But it has significant implications for the United States. Greater Chinese power inevitably challenges American security in East Asia, both in Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia. More power equals greater challenges. When China insists that other countries stop challenging China on their islands, or when China says, we're going to be more proactive, these challenges, whether it's the Philippines, whether it's Japan, and to a much lesser extent, but it still matters, Vietnam, inevitably challenge American alliance interests in East Asia. Regardless of the value of the islands, regardless of American interest in those islands, and remember, those islands are worthless. They have no strategic value whatsoever. And every time the United States Department of Energy publishes an energy map of Southeast Asia, there's no oil worth drilling for anywhere around disputed island. There's oil in the South China Sea, but it's all up against the coastline. That's Vietnam or that's the Philippines. These islands are worthless. But it doesn't matter to the United States. China's use of its greater capability to defend its maritime interests, including its sovereignty claims, inevitably challenges American security and its alliance commitments. What is this U.S. interest? The United States doesn't live in East Asia, but we have a vital interest in the East Asian balance of power. That's why we fought World War II in Asia. No different than American security interests in Europe. We didn't fight World War II in Europe because we didn't like Germany. We fought to keep the balance of power in Europe. We didn't fight World War II against Japan because we didn't like Japan. We fought to keep the balance of power in East Asia. And that's still America's fundamental interest. So at our alliances, we can do that. Forward presence is a requirement. So when China uses those capabilities, it's challenging American commitment to defend our allies, which America feels compelled to resist to keep its alliances stable. So we have, on the one hand, a new China with more power, and the United States feeling a new kind of threat we never felt. A threat by China to the U.S. alliance system in East Asia. Taken together, we have new great power dynamics with new patterns of behavior that persist over time in great power competition. And the first thing we see in this new pattern of great power relations is what we might call alliance dynamics or alliance politics. We've seen small countries challenged by China, and I include Japan as a small country. Japan, the Philippines, Vietnam, challenged by Chinese power. Regardless of the source of the conflict, these countries will say to the U.S., will you defend us? Now, many of us may say that, well, this is the Philippines' fault. And many of us may say, this is Abe's fault. It doesn't matter. They're still going to look at the United States and say, will you defend us? And there will be pressure on the United States to say yes. I'll give you a recent example. Everyone in East Asia blamed Central Asia for the deterioration of mainland Taiwan relations in the first decade of the 21st century. And people would ask, if Central Asia declares independence and China goes to war, will we defend Taiwan? Yes. Because at stake was not independence, who cares? At stake was American commitment to defend its allies that we felt had to be sustained. Well, this is the same pressure we feel today in respect to the Philippines and Japan. For fear that if we don't defend our allies, other countries in the region will watch and will say, the rise of China is challenging America and America lacks the resolve to resist. And we'll begin to drift. In the same way Thailand drifted in 1975, others may begin to drift if they feel the United States is unable to respond to the rise of China. We saw this in the United States and Japan. In 2010, when that fishing boat captain was arrested, the U.S. came to Japan's defense. And for the first time, at a senior level, Secretary of State Clinton, we reassured Japan that the alliance covered those islands. We never did that before. If we ever did before, it was at a very junior level. Bang, right up to the Assistant Secretary. We've been worrying about Japan since the Nixon shock in 1971-72. Oh my God, we did lose Japan. And then we reassured Japan. 2012, We told Japan, don't nationalize those islands. Well, they did it anyway. And yet we supported them strongly after the fact. Not because the islands mattered. Not because China started it, but because we had to defend Japan. 2013, December, China announces its ADIZ in the East China Sea. They looked carefully at what American defense officials said. They said, this is meaningless. We don't care about this announcement. Why? Because they understood that everyone has an ADIZ. China was going to have an ADIZ. One thing that mattered to the Pentagon was if Chinese planes were going to come out more out into airspace, we had to find a way to avoid conflict. Let's move on to the next issue. That's not what the State Department said. State Department said expansionist, aggressive China, frightening Japan, and we had to support Japan. And that's when you got President Obama visiting Tokyo in 2014, April 2014, 3 times, saying the U.S.-Japan alliance covered those islands. No president ever done that before. He did it 3 times. Once before he left, did an interview, once personally, and then 3rd time in the joint statement. This is not about the Senkaku Islands. It's about the U.S.-Japan alliance. We did this with the Philippines. In 2012, through the end of the year, as the standoff was taking place in the South China Sea, you saw strong American support for the Philippines. We recall Secretary of State Clinton went to Manila. She boarded the USS Fitzgerald in Manila to reaffirm American support. And a quote from a Philippine newspaper, I haven't seen it elsewhere, but I believe it. She said, the great Filipino boxer, Pacquiao, there we go. He said, I'm like Manny Pacquiao. I'll be in your corner and I'll fight you. Meanwhile, the Chinese and the Philippine navies are out there at sea on a face-off. This is not about those islands. This is about reassuring the Philippines that indeed America was in your corner. In 2014, we did it again. We recall in 2014, all of a sudden American officials began to talk about coercion, Chinese coercion in the South China Sea. For the first time, an American diplomat criticized China's 9-dash line. Never did that before. Secretary Hagel was out there criticizing China in public speeches. The National Security Advisor for Asia warned China, if you do an ADIZ for the South China Sea, we will reconsider our defense posture in East Asia. That's a threat. We're going to be much more aggressive in our deployments against you if you do that. And then Obama's visit to Manila coincided with the announcement of the new U.S.-Philippine Defense Agreement. Again, this is politics. You could have signed this agreement and announced it 3 months earlier, 3 months later. To announce it when the president was in Manila was designed to reassure Manila, we're in your corner. And again, it's not about Scarborough Shoal. It's about American alliance. Now, on the one hand, you can say, well, this, in some respects, this is inevitable. America's going to worry about its alliances, and China's more powerful. But look at the effect. When we do this, the Chinese watch this, and what do they see? They see U.S. containment of China. And if you watch the Chinese media and Chinese writings, the use of the word containment has escalated in the last 4 or 5 years. It used to be used by some people, not others. Now it's almost used by everyone. And it's clear why. The United States is backing U.S. allies in their territorial disputes with China. And the Chinese are looking at that and they're saying, you're encouraging your allies to challenge Chinese interests. And of course they're right. Regardless of American intentions, American policy says we support you. No. Does anyone think that Abe would be so provocative if he didn't think America was covering his back? course he counts on that. The same with the Philippines and China. Of course the Philippines says, I got American backing. I can resist Chinese challenges in the South China Sea. This is an inevitable Chinese reaction. Again, a rule of international politics. I don't care what American intentions are. All I know is what the effect is of their policy. And the effect of their policy sure looks like containment. And what's China's reaction? Again, inevitable. This is new China. We won't tolerate this. We're going to push back. Thinks he can use his allies and to encourage them to challenge Chinese territorial interests. They're mistaken. Peace will rise. It's over. You challenge Chinese sovereignty, I don't care how it happens, we will resist. So you get a recurring dynamic in this new era of great power relations. China resists change by small states. U.S. supports its allies. China seizes its containment. It pushes back. And you get heightened U.S. tension and heightened regional tension as countries get worried when the United States and China face off. We saw in 2010, we saw in 2012, we saw in 2014. This is not Xi Jinping. This is not Hillary Clinton. This is not Obama. This is great power dynamics. So what do you get? All right? One of the recurring dynamics is alliance politics. But the second result of this is repeated cycles of coercive diplomacy. And that, too, is a new and ongoing, continuing aspect of U.S.-China relations. The Chinese are going to use these new maritime capabilities to push back against U.S. support for American allies in their sovereignty disputes with China. And why are they doing this? Why is China pushing back? Very clearly, what China is doing is they're threatening the United States with war. They're creating the risk of war for America. Should something happen, should a Chinese ship and a Japanese ship collide, should the Philippines get a little too emotional and go after a Chinese ship, should something happen, the U.S. could be dragged into a war with China in support of its ally over what? Some stupid islands in the East China Sea or the South China Sea. Like that's what China's doing. China doesn't have the power to challenge America. It's not going to do that. But indirectly, just want to say to the United States, is this a war you want to fight? By creating tension with American allies. And of course, again, you saw that throughout this period. 2012, 2013, Chinese sent those ships into 12 miles of the Diaoyu Islands. All of a sudden, they're pretty close to Japanese ships. Rumors the Chinese locked on their radar to a Japanese ship. How would the Japanese respond? Would they think they're under attack and fire? Chinese aircraft, maritime civilian aircraft, flying into 12 miles. How would Japan respond? Would they get aggressive? Now Japan, we have Japan's planes scrambling, meeting Chinese jets in the ADIC. I don't believe in accidental war, but then I'm in the Ivory Tower. If I were responsible, I'd look at all these things and I might worry, because if I were responsible, I'd have to start worst-casing things. So what was China doing? They were saying to the United States, you're going to support your Japanese ally and ends up in a conflict with China over these stupid islands? And what did the U.S. do? Oh, China can impose costs. In 2013, we distanced ourselves. Abe came to Washington, brief meeting with Obama, never mentioned those islands. Kerry goes to Beijing in April of 2013, never mentioned those islands. Sunnyland Summit, wonderful U.S.-China summit. Xi Jinping got 2.5 days with Clinton. Abe got 2 hours. And the public description of these meetings never once mentioned the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands until he was asked, the National Security Advisor, by a reporter, and he came out with a vanilla statement saying, well, we want both sides to be nice to each other. None of this is what Japan wanted to hear. We wanted to hear America say, Harry thanked Japan for its restraint. That's not what Japan wanted to hear. The Philippines. China was creating risk of war. We all know that the Philippines can get a little overexcited sometimes. Usually a little critical here. But what happened? Well, we got nervous. Chinese coercive diplomacy, creating the risk of war, we backed off. 2013, we stopped mentioning the word sovereignty disputes. We even stopped mentioning the word Philippines. We said territorial disputes in the South China Sea. Nice and neutral. Never mentioned it at Sunnyland. Not once did South China Sea come up in any of the briefings. That's what coercive diplomacy does. It makes countries think about the cost and risk of war. You want to see the turning point for that? It's very clear. This is part of the American policy-making dynamic. Who's responsible for foreign policy? Oh, well, under the first term of the Obama administration, it was Secretary of State Clinton. But this is the way American politics works. When the president travels, the National Security Council is responsible for everything he says and does. So they write his speeches. And all of a sudden, the National Security Council now can make policy. And it was clear at the end of 2012 that East Asia was a mess. China, Philippines, China, Japan, U.S. on one side, China on the other. Vietnam is getting really scared of China. And it doesn't take a genius to look at that and say, well, American policy may not be working. And if you look at the speech given by the National Security Advisor right before Obama left for Thailand, Burma, and Cambodia, it was about as, forgive me, anti-Clinton. This was the new policy. Now, clearly, this is new era. The United States and China have new policy challenges. The United States is very clear. We need to manage American alliances and our strategic partnerships to avoid entrapment, to avoid being trapped in our allies' conflict with China, while simultaneously sustaining our alliance relationships, because they're so vital. I would suggest to you this is not difficult. It's not difficult because our allies have nowhere else to go. Japan's not going anywhere. We're the only game in town. And the alliance is the only choice they have. The Philippines isn't going anywhere. We're the only game in town, and they need that U.S.-Filipino alliance. The United States can both constrain its allies while reassuring them simultaneously that we're committed to your defense. How do we do that? Well, for example, it didn't work very well in this case, but in 1975, Saigon falls, Thailand's nervous, they threw our bases out in 1975. And the U.S. had a massive arms sale package, not arms sales, arms transfer package to Thailand. That was a way of saying, you're still our friend, and we're going to sell you weapons. We did two things at once. We're not going to support you on those islands. We did this with Century again. You're on your own if you declare independence. But we were still going to like Taiwan. Now, did he believe us? He didn't believe us. He was probably right not to believe us. Trying to use force for going to war. But you can do two things at once. We haven't done this well. The United States, as we can all see, has had a preoccupation with credibility. We, worst case, our credibility concerns. So the effect is that we're acting out of credibility concerns when we should have confidence that our capabilities are sufficient to maintain our alliances. We, simultaneously, the United States, has to accept the reality of Chinese power. What do I mean by that? Well, at the end of the Cold War, the United States could sail anywhere in the world. We could fight any navy in the world and never lose a ship. That's not normal. In the history of international politics, that's not normal. And it was inevitable that China would begin to develop capabilities that would impose costs on America. That's different than saying America would lose the war, we don't have supremacy, we don't dominate. It's simply saying that war is dangerous. Oh, this should be obvious. War is dangerous. And now war is dangerous for America. Now, think about Britain during the 19th century. We always used to say Britain controlled the seas, ruled the seas. It did. But Britain also knew that if there was a naval war with France, it would be dangerous and costly. Wars are never cheap, even when you rule the seas. And that's where America is today. We have to adjust to the fact that we're number one, but that war is dangerous. But if you were confident that you were number one, you'd worry less about credibility. And we're having a hard time doing that. But China has a major challenge too. China has to learn how to manage its own power. And it has not done a good job. For China, the challenge is, with this new capability, not to do too much too soon. Because if you do too much too soon, you look aggressive, you look expansionist, and other countries are going to get worried. So, for example, in 2010, that was a disaster for China. It was picking fights everywhere. Didn't help us out in North Korea. Picked a fight with Japan. South China Sea was heating up. We had an incident with the Impeccable in the South China Sea. It was a bad year for China. And what did China get? Got the pivot. Too much, too soon, and it wasn't good for China. 2012, the ADIZ at the end of the year. It was just too much for the U.S. to bear. I'm convinced that if China had done the ADIZ at the end of 2015, with better diplomacy, no one would have cared. But when you do that ADIZ after the Philippines and after Japan and after South China Sea, with the United States and the exclusive economic zone, too much to bear. And then you got that American reaction. Our allies are getting nervous. China, look how fast it's moving. We have to do something. And what did they get? They got Obama to Tokyo, Obama to Manila, Secretary Hagel criticizing Chinese coercion, the 9-dash line, too much too soon. Rising powers have to be patient if they don't want to push back. So what we're seeing is alliance politics, permanent aspect of the new U.S.-China relationship, and recurring cycles of coercive diplomacy. Not going to go away. It's going to see cycles. It will come down, and something will happen somewhere where America sees the need to reassure, and China pushes back. Now, a few more other thoughts before I finish up. One is on this recurring tension in the China's EEZ between U.S. and Chinese aircraft and ships. And the common questions we ask is, what is China doing? This is dangerous. Wrong question. The right question is, why is China doing this? And then the answer is easy. It wants to impose the risk of war on the United States. China does not like American boats within 200 miles. It does not like American aircraft within 200 miles. And if it does nothing, we're going to keep on doing it. The only way to get America to reconsider is to impose some costs. And then America begins to ask itself, is there other ways that we can achieve our purposes with surveillance and espionage without putting our ships into 200 miles? And maybe the answer is yes. And maybe the answer is that we don't have to do this often. But we would never reach those conclusions. It had become dangerous. Again, this is coercive diplomacy by China in the 200-mile economic zone to coerce the United States to rethink its policies by imposing costs. This is what countries do. Don't ask, why are they being so reckless? Ask, why are they doing it? And finally, some thoughts on the United States and Vietnam. The recent American decision to end our arms embargo on Vietnam. Why are we doing this? Well, I have to admit, I don't really know. But from a distance, I would suggest that one of the things we're doing is we're saying, look, we can impose costs on you. If you get too ambitious in the South China Sea, too aggressive, well, we can make friends with that neighboring country on your border that you've had a long history of problems. This, I would suggest to you, is a mistake. Just as we're overreacting in some places, the Chinese are overreacting in other places, this is an American overreaction. Why? Because just as China's getting stronger in the South China Sea, we are getting weaker day by day in Indochina. American ability to compete with China on the mainland of Asia gets worse every day, and here we are trying to compete with China for influence in Vietnam. We're going to lose that battle. There's no upside, no gain to that. Things to remember about Vietnam and China. You think about their maritime conflict and in the South China Sea and what happened to their boats, and they could have some naval conflict. Wrong question. Vietnam doesn't think about a naval conflict with China. It thinks about 1.4 billion people on this land border. When was the last time you saw an American military officer talk about the Chinese Army? Yeah, we don't care about the Chinese Army. Air Force and Navy, we care about that. When was the last time you saw Mongolia talk about the Chinese Navy? They talk about the Chinese Army. Right? It all depends where you sit. If you're Vietnam, you don't care about the Chinese Navy. You care about the PLA. And I guarantee you, what happened in 1979 when China invaded Vietnam, it would look very different today. China's gone through 30 years, 35 years of modernization, and Vietnam has been wasting away for those 35 years as it's done in battle with a corrupt military. So imagine a Sino-Vietnamese naval tension. How does China respond? It puts a division on the border. Oh, maybe Vietnam doesn't want to take that risk. And that's why America trying to challenge China and Vietnam is such a mistake, because they can't compete. Now, bring it back. This is a new world. This is a new era in U.S.-China relations that's not going to go away. Peaceful rise is over. Bide your time, stay low, it's over. Chinese ships are now going to be a constant presence in the South China Sea, patrolling the entire water. What's Red Eye Reef all about? That's not a military base they're building on that island near the Philippines. That's simply an ability for their maritime forces to have a constant presence, to patrol the fishing grounds, and patrol their sovereignty. You can't fight a war with that. But during peacetime, that presence is going to be constant in disputed waters around East Asia. So what we're demanding in this new period, and neither country has done well in the initial adjustment process, is mutual adjustment. America having to know how to deal with your allies. China having to know how to deal with your own power. This is not easy, but to date, we can say it's been very costly.
Thank you very much, Professor Ross.